the way from New York City. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Lex Pelger.
As for me in technology, what really changed my life, probably more than any other event, was one Craigslist ad. I was new to New York City. I'd grown up in farm country, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where all the Amish people are from. Yeah, amen. For some reason, you guys love that. I just think they slow down traffic, but are nice people. But that's what I grew up in. So when I got to New York City, I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. It was beautiful. It was exciting. And I did what any young techno-optimist farm boy would do. And I went on Craigslist, and I would cruise the volunteer section looking for interesting events going on around New York City that might need a helping hand. And I got in some really fun little weird niches of the city that way. But the one that caught my eye was one titled BDSM Training Session Looking for Bottom. And I didn't really know much about what this meant. And it said that they were going to have 10 to 12 dominatrixes having a teaching session, and they needed a bottom who would be okay with piercings, suturings, needle play, sharps, penetration, subjugations. And I took a line from Shel Silverstein's The Perfect High, which is a beautiful poem. And I said, well, hell, says Roy, I'm a healthy boy, and I'll crawl or climb or fly until I find the guru who will give me the clue as to what's the perfect high. And so I sent an email, and I said, I have a couple piercings, I'm 23 and I'm in shape, and I'll give this a try, whatever it is. And so I got an email back pretty quickly from Mistress Troy Orleans, and I was so new to the scene that I didn't even realize that wasn't her real name. But she told me that that I sounded pretty good, come and meet her in person and just chat about all this. And so we set a date. And I was biking from Brooklyn, and right as I got on the Manhattan Bridge over the East River, it was one of those summertime squalls and just downpour. So it's about 40 blocks up to where she was, and completely soaked down to everything. And so she buzzes me into the building, and it's a really nice brownstone, very high end. And actually, it was so efficient, and the elevator was so good that by the time that the door opened with her standing there, I hadn't finished changing out of my wet clothes yet. So she found me shirtless with one pant leg rolled up and then just dripping water all over their nice, thick, fancy carpets, which was a little embarrassing. But luckily, Miss Troy Orleans was definitely a southern belle. And so she was very gracious, and she led me into her dungeon, and she went and she found me some towels. And it gave me a chance just to look around, and it was like nothing I'd ever seen before in my life. I hadn't looked at porn like this. I didn't know much about it. And there were a couple cabinets filled with whippers and floggers and paddles and electrical play and full body suits with gas masks and other things that I just didn't quite figure out what the fuck they could be used for to titillate or to harm. And there was a hanging bed of leather in the corner with big, thick chains hanging there for a sub to be on top of. And so Troy brings me out some towels, and I started drying off, and she tells me a little bit about her work and about how she sees clients and the different kinds of things that they like done to themselves. And I just had no idea that there would be men who would pay a very large woman to tie them up and then to tickle them with a feather duster until they peed themselves and pay $300 for the privilege. And I thought this was a really fascinating idea. And so already I was hooked by all of this. But I told her that I was vanilla. I hadn't tried any of this before, but I would give it a try. And she said, it sounds great. Just drop your pants and let's finish this off. And so I dropped my pants, and she's like, okay, you'll do. She's like, sometimes there are people that just don't quite have enough to work with there. You'll do okay. And that's not much of a brag, because what the Pelger men actually have is really large testicles. Like my grandfather and my father before me, and my nephew after me as well, which my sister really hates when I say in public. But we have really big balls, so they get remarked on a lot. Unfortunately, there's just kind of an inverse ratio effect going on. But at least we got something, It is a party trick, and it does work. And so she said, we set up the date, hearty handshake, and I left Troy and hit the road again. And so it was just a couple weeks later, and I show up another very attractive brownstone, and get let into the training session, which is already underway with another sub being worked on another one of those hanging tables in the middle of the room, surrounded by about 10 dominatrixes. But I couldn't see really anything but the fat man, because I had never seen anything like that. It was one of the big Wall Street types, rolls of fat, pasty white skin, and he just had needles everywhere, all throughout his body. Needles going up and down his arms and through his nipples, down his legs, and through webs of fingers and toes, and through scrotums and penises. And it was like nothing I'd ever seen. And it was really his eyes that stood out, because they were those big, rolling Rodney Dangerfield-style eyes, and they were almost rolling out of his head. And what I saw in those eyes is what now I know is called subspace, that kind of disassociated place you reach when you've totally given up control to someone else, and you are in the other world. And it's something I recognized, and it looked familiar from psychedelic trips as well. The same way when you see the eye of God on acid or DMT or something like that, or prayer or meditation. It's all in that way humans have to get high, just like the old Russian monks would flagellate themselves until they reached the other world and saw God. And that's what I saw in his eyes, which was a fascinating view into why people were doing this. But then they got to the point where they started pulling out the needles. And that's when he kind of lost that beatific look in his eyes, and it just got to be the painful look. And I realized it isn't always so good. And he had a little bit of whine to his voice at one point, and one of the pro-doms stopped him and said, "Listen, you're being worked on by 10 of some of the best women working in New York City. And if you paid for this would be tens of thousands of dollars, so shut the fuck up." And so this was fascinating for me to watch and sit back, because it looked more like a book club than it did anything else. And nobody was acknowledging me, which was really nice, because I was nervous. I didn't know what was going on. The only person who really looked in my direction was the slave of Mr. Sakia, who was running the session. And he had handcuffs on, and then chains attaching the handcuffs to his nipples. So he was just stuck here like this. And so he didn't have anything else. So he was the one who gave me the nod of recognition and said hello. But everyone else just ignored me, which made things a lot easier. And so they said it was my turn to get on the table. And I guess this is where people always ask if I was nervous. And I was certainly nervous about the pain of all this happening, but the rest of it felt really natural, that this was something worth diving into. I didn't know if I was into it. I didn't know if it was going to be sexual, but I knew that life is short and give it a try. Ever since because I also grew up Christian, but when I read Strange in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein at 14, that changed everything. And if I could see the audience, I'd probably see at least half the heads nodding their heads at this. I mean, that was the first chink in my Christian armor. There are other ways to do this love and family and sex thing. And so it felt like a natural progression, just go through this door as I get to New York City. And so I lay down, I'm naked on the table. Mr. Stocky is giving a very informative speech about informed consent and about where to buy the medical staples, how you might administer them, the type of supplies that you would have for this kind of work. And she said, and the whole time I'm watching, because the thing I am most worried about is the pain. And so I'm watching her gesticulate with this thing, and I look at it like a knife, just watching for when she's going to whack me. And she says, the cool part about stapling is that it's a step below needle play. It's not as hard. It's not as high an entry level point. It doesn't hurt as much. She said you can really just fool around with it. You can have some fun with it. Whap! And she whacks me in the chest. And she was right. It actually didn't hurt that much. I had that little endorphin rush, and it was just like in elementary school when you accidentally caught yourself. It was a little bit annoying, but it wasn't that bad. So that fear dissipated a little bit. And then she started really giving a lecture about if you're having perhaps a fun session with your sub, you can do something interesting like make designs. And she and she makes a little flower over my heart. And all the doms think this is so cute. They think this is beautiful. And she says, and if you're doing more of a psychological intimidation type session, you could do something creative like this. And she said, this is a special favorite of mine. I'm pretty proud of this one, she said. And so she had a long rubber band, and then she stapled one end to here into my side in the short ribs, which felt that one a little bit more. And she stapled one into the fleshy under part of the arm, which is another place that hurt. And then she started to tickle me. And I said, actually, I'm not really ticklish, or at least not there. And she said, well, that's okay. And she reaches behind herself, and she has one of those rackets, the ones that are electrified so you can knock mosquitoes out of the air. And she just touches it right on the funny bone. And my arm goes, whoo, like that. And then pulls on both ends and tries to pull the staples out of the skin. But they stay in place. And again, the doms laugh and they think this is funny. And I have to admit, it was pretty damn clever. It was a really interesting idea. And so she says, okay, go to it. And so then all the dominatrix gather around and just start working on me. All kinds of little things. But that endorphin rush is partially protecting me from lots and lots, dozens of staples going in everywhere. But what fascinates me even more is the shop talk. Because, what do people do in a profession when they get together? They talk shop around the water cooler. I mean, except this time I was the water cooler and I was covered in staples. But it's the same idea, and it was the same kind of fascinating look into what these women did and how they made their money. And it got really good because it got to be a little bit like a competition session. It was a little bit like frat boys bragging about all the girls they had banged. It's like, oh, you think that's crazy? Well, this guy that I had to kick him in the balls until he pissed blood. I'd never seen anything like it. And then I started, well, if you think that's wild, and on and on and on into sexual kinks and perversions that I'd never even heard of. That was one of the most fascinating parts of the whole thing. And so at the end, Mr. Sakias says that this is the part where it gets less fun for your stub because it hurts a lot more to pull out the staples than it does to put them in. And it's a little scissors type device you can just buy. And it pinches in the middle and pulls it up, but there's a little bit of tear when it comes out. And that's when the one thing she did before that, though, that she wanted to show at the end was the corset effect. And she said, if you really want to get inside a sub's head, then what you do is you make a corset out of the staples. And so she took my scrotum, enough scrotum to cover any needs you might have. And you should see my flowering lotus. There's a good party trick. And she covered up here and then stapled the scrotum in place. So if I would have gotten an erection, it would have been pulling against the staples. It would have been a punishment for me. The thing was, there was no chance that I was getting an erection out of this. By the time that they were pulling staples out of me, I had learned enough about my own kinks and sexuality that this was not something I was going to be getting off on, which was a really important thing to know. But I learned that day about my sexuality. But then the event itself triggered a cascade because I started dating one of the doms, and then she took me to a porn shoot in Dumbo. And at the porn shoot, I met a woman named Diana Adams, one of the queens of poly out there. I figured there'd be some people who knew her. And that opened me up into the entire world of New York City psychedelics and open love and the fetish tribes there. And really opened my world up in completely beautiful and novel ways that never would have happened if I didn't go to this session. And so, the thing I learned through all that, though, is that even though this is how my whole entrance to this world started, I am as vanilla as they come. I don't like any of this stuff. I like pregnant girls, and I like lactation. You don't get more vanilla than that, But I learned that the last thing that I really get off on is hearing about all the different ways that people get off. That's the most beautiful part. That's the most exciting part. And so I learned you just have to pick your own poison. So buy the ticket and take the ride. Thank you.